A new series of explosions in Crimea. God, SBU, don't stop. Tarkankut, Donuzlav, Yevpatoria, Saki district, Bakhchisarai district, Kacha, Sevastopol. Explosions? Panic has started in Crimea. Evacuation is underway in Crimea. The SBU has launched the second phase of the special operation, the Crimean Bridge and Russia's nuclear triad. Ukraine is attacking two parts of Russia's nuclear triad: the headquarters of the Northern Fleet, the nuclear submarines in Severomorsk, strategic nuclear bombers, and the Crimean Bridge.
The bridge has been damaged. That is, at least one of the bridge's supports has been damaged. If we look at the overall attack on Russian strategic targets, specifically strategic ones, because, for example, strikes on Russian strategic aviation aircraft are strategic targets, especially since there were five, as it turned out, five of them, just as we said. The thing is, Ukrainka wasn't counted. At least one Tu-95 at Ukrainka has been hit, which has already been confirmed. So strategic aviation, and after that, the strategic bridge. The bridge truly has strategic significance because it connects the Russian Taman with our peninsula Crimea. And if it is put out of commission, destroyed in principle until we liberate Crimea, or for example, until it becomes possible to approach with bombers and simply drop hundreds of aerial bombs on this bridge, it cannot be destroyed. There are certain factors that make it impossible to do this. The only options there are either engineering methods for its destruction, that is blowing up all the pillars, which would require, well, there will be a lot of problems at the very least with deactivating it from an active state, but simply damaging it at the moment, as was done previously by the security service both in 2022 and 2023, disabling it for a certain period, at least for half a year, for example, during the summer campaign, is indeed possible. Moreover, a strike specifically on the Kerch Bridge is tied to the beginning, to the start of our liberation campaign for the deoccupation of the Crimean Peninsula. Why? Because without a doubt, the bridge must first be destroyed or damaged or put out of commission. There are different ways to do this in order to prevent the Russians from transferring a sufficient number of troops to Crimea. After that, using long-range strike capabilities, those same drones, missiles up to Crimea, that's 200 to 300 kilometers. It's possible almost all of our equipment can reach that distance. So that's the main range for our long-range operational level strike systems, which are handled, among others, by the security service. That's why I think the next wave will be strikes specifically on military targets in Crimea, of which there are at least 100 stationary ones currently operating and about another 100 mobile ones. So the work of the special services lies ahead. There's a vast amount of so-called work to be done, but you could say that the strike on the Kerch Bridge is already the beginning of this liberation campaign in Crimea.
Roman Grigorievich, regarding the nuclear triad, I heard Keith Kellogg's comments. He's simply stunned. He believes this is simply a huge, colossal problem for Russia. This is called escalation, that Ukraine struck at the nuclear triad of the Russian Federation at two of its components, right? That's the Northern Fleet of the Russian Federation, where the nuclear submarines are located, and of course, the strategic nuclear aviation. How much of a breakthrough is this, and do you feel that the strike on the Kerch Bridge is the second phase of the SBU's special operation?
That means there will be a third phase as well. If, for example, a submarine gets hit, say a Russian one in the Northern Fleet or even in the Pacific Fleet, I wouldn't be surprised because they feel far too comfortable in the seas. We have already struck both Russian ground positions and Russian strategic positions. The only thing left is the so-called naval component. That's why in the near future, most likely, if you remember, or rather, if you haven't noticed, the main intelligence directorate has gone quiet somewhere. They carried out operations in Vladivostok against the Russian Pacific Fleet and then went quiet somewhere, not ruling out the possibility that another Russian submarine might sink. And Putin, as always, will say, well, what happened to the Kursk, to the submarine? It sank. What happened to the strategic aviation? It burned down. What happened to the Pacific Fleet? Well, it broke down into quarks. So maybe we should wait. There's probably still a third serious blow ahead. And this is the first one. You're right to point out the triad. You're emphasizing it correctly. Why? Because the air component is one of the main components and it was the first to be put into service. It is specifically the strategic bombers that make up Russia's strategic nuclear arsenal. Malyuk's strike showed that this component no longer dominates the world, definitely. Why? Because, well, a relatively inexpensive $500 drone, or more accurately, simply a sufficient number of these unmanned aerial vehicles, can practically and quite effectively destroy Russia's strategic aviation capabilities. That is indeed entirely possible. Everyone understands perfectly well that the era of drones has already begun. The era of drones. It feels like in the near future, planet Earth will turn into a kind of planet of iron and steel. No water, no vegetation, no natural resources, inhabited by robots. In other words, populated by these very drones. And in the end, the terrifying apocalypse that was once vividly shown in many Hollywood movies could very well become a devastating reality. So this is indeed a profoundly serious and significant problem for all the numerous countries around the entire world that have heavily invested in robust strategic security mechanisms and comprehensive defense protocols. Well, what was the point of investing tens of trillions of dollars over the past 100 years into something that, in the end, a $500 drone can just take out in a matter of seconds? And that's what the Maluk demonstrated. That's why I would say that the Malyuks of the Security Service of Ukraine have come to the forefront at the beginning of a new era in security provision. Other mechanisms, the real investment should be in robots. By robots, I mean, well, obviously sophisticated drones. These are advanced drones that can accomplish major and complex tasks with minimal resources, with very little financial funding. Basically, all these current strategies and conventional approaches will eventually be completely destroyed and rendered obsolete. Once, if anyone remembers, Raikin, I think, may he rest in peace, once said he had a great monologue. Where are those six-story fools, the dinosaurs? Where did they go extinct? But the little bug, it's been living and thriving for 30 billion or however many 3 billion years. So that's more or less what it's like now. The next era will be something along those lines. In other words, the little bugs we're talking about now, meaning the small drones, they'll keep getting smaller and smaller, but without losing their combat power. And eventually, what will they come to? To the point that Putin recently predicted, together with Skabiva and all the rest of the Russian media riffraff. Ukrainian combat mosquitoes. You were just laughing about combat mosquitoes. Believe me, when billions of Ukrainian combat mosquitoes invade Russian Siberia or say the Trans-Urals, let alone the Urals themselves, not a single Russian will be left there. They'll be drawn to the scent. And the Russian spirit smells so strong, oh boy, no filter can help with that, not a single one. You really have to put on gas masks if there are Russian federal troops nearby. So naturally, following the scent, these Ukrainian combat mosquitoes will wipe out the entire Russian herd, all those Russian federalists who invaded Ukraine.
Roman Grigorievich, regarding the Northern Fleet and the Pacific Fleet of Russia, how feasible is it to carry out a special operation there at all?
Well, it's definitely possible. As for the Northern Fleet, on the one hand, it's simply closer because it's just over 1,000 kilometers away. And in fact, we've already carried out missions there. Olenia is not far from the base. Yes, so this direction is in principle possible even with long-range strike systems launched from our territory. But as for Vladivostok, in some ways that's even easier. We've discussed before, what is Vladivostok? Well, it's Zeleny Klin. It's the Far Eastern Ukrainian People's Republic, which is populated not by robots, but by Ukrainians. Well, Ukrainians, genetically, for over 100 years, tens of thousands of Ukrainians were brought there under certain programs, mostly from the Poltava and Chernihiv regions. Why is there an airfield called Chernihivka there? Well, I know this, for example, from the airfields. Chernihivka and also Ukrainka, these are ours. These are our people from Poltava natives and residents of the Chernihiv region back in the day. Naturally, genetic roots make themselves known. And Vladivostok is actually one of the main jewels of our Ukrainian green wedge. Of course, getting to Vladivostok is not a small challenge. All the more so if, in the end, the government in exile of the Far Eastern Ukrainian People's Republic is recognized, then it could even, for example, sign agreements with, say, Japan regarding the return of those same disputed islands, so-called disputed, but they're Japanese islands. And Sakhalin too, that's a Japanese island. So this issue really needs to be addressed there in parallel, of course, by putting pressure on the Pacific Fleet, because there are Ukrainians in the fleet as well. Do you really think our midshipmen aren't there? Every other one of them is bound to be Ukrainian, our good old deep-rooted genetic tree when it comes to midshipmen, because back in the day, all the warrant officers in the Soviet army were Ukrainians, and all the midshipmen in the fleet were Ukrainians too. So believe me, If the survival of our nation is at stake, this so-called call of our ancestors will make it possible to sink practically the entire Pacific Fleet. And if we approach our relations with the Japanese and South Koreans the right way, they'll even help us, because it's in their interest too.
Roman Grigorievich, when you spoke with analysts, they said that the Topol and Yars are part of the powerful nuclear arsenal of the Russian Federation. How important are these assets? And, for example, is the destruction of a Topol or Yars a realistic goal for the special services, Ukrainian ones, of course?
Well, that's rather complicated, of course. The thing is, these are, after all, strategic missile forces. That is, there is a certain selection process for service there. There are some aspects related to polygraph testing, so there is very strict control over this component, and it would be very difficult, for example, to get close enough to destroy these missiles. The Russians will ruin them themselves. Well, considering that they're all pretty clumsy, they'll ruin them themselves. The Topol is an excellent, truly excellent missile. It was first launched, I believe, back in the 1980s in the Soviet Union, and then the Russians refined it to a more or less acceptable state. But the main basic, so to speak, fundamental starting conditions, of course, were still established in the Soviet Union. There was a strong tradition there, especially in the field of rocketry, especially after that, and after our Ukrainian nation practically bet everything, its entire future, on the ambitious rocket program, if you vividly remember, as the esteemed General Secretary of the CPSU Central Committee, Nikita Khrushchev successfully fulfilled this crucial task, and Leonid Brezhnev subsequently refined and further developed it with great dedication. Again, both of them were Ukrainians. That's why the rocket field was, of course, very well developed in the Soviet Union. The Russians picked up certain aspects, but because the Soviet Union collapsed and the components of the overall production cycle ended up scattered across different republics, things changed. By the way, the main ones were with us. In Ukraine, we built the same SS-18, the same Satan missile. It was us who made it at Yuzhmash. Naturally, the Topol missile, Topol is a successor in this kind of missile program, especially the Topol-M, which is a pretty good missile. The second one after it is also not exactly a clone, but basically the same kind of missile, just with a different warhead with multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicles. That's already the Yars. First Topol-M, then Yars, RS-24, and then RS-26. They built or tried to build the Oreshnik, also known as Rubezh. That's the Rubezh. Putin called it Oreshnik. And the next line, the fourth missile, is the RS-28, which is the Sarmat, but the Sarmat doesn't even leave its launch silo anymore. Out of 7 launches, 6 ended in explosions and several silos were completely destroyed. And most likely this whole series of missiles has been written off. So they won't really have the Sarmat, and with the Oreshnik, they'll keep running around like fools with a rattle. And once its informational hype dies down, they'll forget about it too. But there are 2 missiles that are serious and problematic for us and for the whole world, namely the Topol and the Yars. They can travel more than 10,000 kilometers. These are intercontinental ballistic missiles with nuclear warheads on both the Topol and the Yars. The Yars has multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicles, each with self-guidance, around 6 warheads that are deployed. So this is indeed a serious problem. But it's probably not as much of a problem for us because these are nuclear weapons and the Russians aren't going to use nukes against us. And to use a conventional intercontinental ballistic missile against us would be like using a microscope to hammer in nails. So this isn't a problem for us. It's a problem for NATO generals and for the Chinese as well, the Chinese. In other words, these are long-range destruction mechanisms. For us, the main problem is the Iskanders, the Iskander KN-23s, and the Kinjal missiles, that is ballistic and aeroballistic missiles that need to be neutralized. The optimal way to neutralize the use of these missiles is, of course, to destroy the Russian hydrocarbon industry, because everything depends on something. Diesel, gasoline, they fly on aviation kerosene. The hydrocarbon industry needs to be destroyed. Bankova has ensured the safety of the Russian hydrocarbon industry. That's why this problem exists, because it's very difficult to defend against a ballistic missile. We should have had our own a long time ago. It's already the 7th year. We probably could have put these missiles into serious production, but so far they still haven't appeared. Well, we hope that in the end we will get them, our ballistic missiles. But the real problem for us, of course, is the Russian Iskanders. Because first we need to destroy all Russian oil refineries and everything related to fuel production. And second, of course, is air defense. That is increasing the number of anti-ballistic systems like Patriot, SAMP-T. There are no other options. There is no third option.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine Today. Join us now.
Roman Grigorievich, you have always said that we need to turn our attention to the occupied Crimea. And now the SBU has carried out a successful special operation. Then they blew up the bridges near Melitopol. Yes, these are very important logistical hubs that connect the occupied peninsula with the occupied south of Ukraine. And essentially, they sustain the enemy's groupings. How do you assess the situation now? Last night, there were explosions. And during the day, the explosions in Crimea continue. We are attacking military targets. Please, the floor is yours.
They packed Crimea like sardines in a can with several million Russians from beyond the Urals who were promised something grand there. In other words, they increased the number of Russian cattle in Crimea. Naturally, they also packed military facilities in there over the course of 11, almost 12 years now. Before that, the Russian Black Sea Fleet was based there. We allowed them to do that. Well, mostly our so-called great leaders who looked so far ahead that in the end, they lost Crimea in the first place, initially allowing its loss in 2014. So a large number of Russian civilian invaders, they are indeed civilian invaders. None of the conventions apply to them, not a single one. They don't even know this, but any Russian who is on the occupied territory of Ukraine is considered an invader, and none of the conventions that protect civilians apply to them. That is, naturally for us, they are the same kind of invaders as all the other so-called Russian military combatants who are in Crimea and are subject to elimination. Eliminating them in principle is not that difficult, specifically in Crimea. Why? Because Crimea itself is an enclosed space squeezed between two seas, the Azov and the Black Sea. In other words, it is practically a ready-made geographic operational cauldron with only two entry and exit points, from Taman via the Kerch Bridge and through the land corridors connecting it to mainland Ukraine. Mainly, if you look at the railway, it goes toward Melitopol, so those branches go there. That's why for us, when it comes to liberating Ukraine, it's important to start liberating everything from Crimea, because it's much easier to free Ukrainian territory if we liberate Crimea first. Moreover, it's even easier to liberate Crimea itself if you compare, for example, the ratio of forces and resources needed to liberate Donbas. You need an order of magnitude fewer forces and resources to liberate Crimea than to liberate Donbas. That's why, without a doubt, Crimea is simply asking to be the very first to break free from Russian captivity. There are a lot of mechanisms. How can this be done? Well, first of all, of course, we need to cut off all the bridges that connect Crimea to the Russians. There are several of these bridges. Well, the first bridge is the Kerch Bridge. Moreover, there are several there, a railway bridge, a road bridge, an energy bridge, a fuel bridge, and a water bridge. All of these are part of the Kerch system, the entire Kerch Bridge system. And it is absolutely necessary to destroy all of them, all 5 of these bridges in this regard. The second bridge, the one next to the Kerch Bridge, is the ferry crossing. The floating docks need to be destroyed. The floating docks and, of course, especially the railway ferries. The third bridge, generally speaking, is the so-called sea bridge. That is, these are the same large landing ships which can be used as ferries between ports, for example, from the Russian Black Sea coast to our Crimea. There are still several large landing ships left, and the Russians can use them to transport a significant amount of weaponry with serious tonnage. Then there is the air bridge. Well, the air bridge is a bit simpler. That is, these are planes, these are airfields that can be targeted. And in principle, the air bridge can be cut off. And the main thing, of course, is the so-called land bridge, the land corridor, which the Russians are now trying to hold at a depth of 80 kilometers. By the way, it's very difficult to do this since it's pressed up against the Azov coast. There are several branches of both highways and railways running through there. That's why, of course, we need to and can target them, starting from Rostov, Taganrog, then through the Mius, and then across the bridges over the Kalmius. But realistically, for us, it's much closer, about 80 to 100 kilometers to Melitopol and to the crossings, both types, meaning the northern crossings. And in principle, that's probably what we'll do. That's why these strikes, which happened simultaneously both on the Kerch Bridge and on the bridge near Melitopol, were precisely on the railway junctions. This is exactly that kind of operation. First, you cut off the supply systems, and then you hit them with long-range strike assets, which everyone understands perfectly. If we manage to gather nearly 1,000 drones for Moscow, then we can definitely find 500 drones once a week for Crimea. The main thing now is to retarget specifically to this component. And the milestone regarding the liberation of Crimea is the third strike on the Kerch Bridge. You could say that the liberation of Crimea will begin with this strike. First, with long-range strike assets, they will dismantle Crimea molecule by molecule over the course of, well, half a year or even a year. Realistically, if you break it down by actions first for several months up to a year, drones and missiles need to be used against military targets in Crimea. And only then, starting next spring or maybe during the summer campaign of 2026, will our troops actually move into Crimea by land. But that's the optimal scenario. Of course, without air support, it's impossible to advance there. That's why I think that by next spring, we'll already have a sufficient amount. Aviation units to provide support specifically for the ground operation. Well, of course, we'll be harassing Crimea up and down.
In general, the Crimean summer of 2025 promises to be quite hot indeed.
Absolutely. And Russians really need to remember, as we discussed with you previously back in 23, they truly need to learn how to swim, because the Kerch Bridge will, without a doubt, be completely gone. But the exits from Crimea will definitely be under control, so Russians will have to swim freestyle, breaststroke, or dog paddle their way out of Crimea if they don't leave now by car or train, because those routes simply won't exist.
Run, run, Rashists, get out of Crimea. Friends, please like this video. Write in the comments what you think about our special operations, about the second and third phases of the SBU special operation. And Roman Grigorievich and I will continue discussing the SBU Operation Web. It can be put on par with the elimination of Osama bin Laden, said US Senator Richard Blumenthal. He called the operation itself proof of Ukraine's agility and determination. He said these strikes disprove the false narrative that Ukraine is losing the war and could shift momentum in Washington toward increasing aid to Ukraine. They can hit air bases 4,000 miles from Ukraine. They can strike anywhere. In terms of sheer skill and audacity, these attacks can be ranked alongside the US raid on Osama bin Laden and the Israeli operation with the PJs as some of the greatest military achievements of recent years. Roman Grigorievich, please comment.
The Americans weren't shocked because we struck the Russians. The Americans imagined themselves in that position, and now they're shocked to realize that their air bases are just as exposed as the Russian ones. They were protected from each other by treaties. That is, there were certain agreements, I think, like New START. There was a specific protection of strategic strike assets under these treaties. Moreover, one of the main conditions was that these planes had to be accessible for monitoring by external surveillance systems like satellites. So as a direct and unavoidable result, both the Russian and the American forces are explicitly required to park their respective planes in designated areas that are clearly visible to the opposing side. But we're not the opposing side. No one told Malyuk about this. He hasn't read the New START treaty. Naturally, he went ahead and struck the Russian strategic bombers, taking one issue off the table. And now the Americans are thinking, wait a minute, the same thing could happen at their bases too. And their bases are wide open. Nobody's even bothered to secure them. If the Chinese or the Houthis or the Iranians or the Russians set out to take out the Russian, American strategic forces, then those would be gone too. And if the Chinese get serious about it, especially, they'll really go for it. We can see that in this regard, the Chinese are ahead of everyone else in the world. That's their problem now. They're not shocked by our so-called audacity. They're shocked by their own vulnerability to these kinds of weapons like drones, even a simple cheap drone.
Yes, Roman Grigorievich, today I read a brilliant analysis by a woman on Facebook, a Ukrainian, a patriot. She wrote that the whole world, which is afraid of escalation, of nuclear escalation, which didn't give us long-range missiles, which didn't give us Taurus and other missiles that could have destroyed this entire nuclear triad, they're simply in shock, in fear that Ukraine managed to do all this without their help. Isn't that right, Roman Grigorievich?
That is precisely how it truly is. Full credit goes to the insightful person who perceived it in this particular way. Someone who is intimately familiar with military matters and affairs. That's exactly how it is. What was important in the last century is now absolutely irrelevant, just as what was important in the century before last was irrelevant for the last century. No one now remembers the sling or the boomerang unless we're talking about something other than a missile. No one remembers bows, arrows, or spears anymore. Now that is in the last century when rockets and airplanes appeared, and now we're already at the next stage. So what was needed in the last century is simply unnecessary now. Strategic bombers are no longer needed, nor, for example, is that same fleet that used to consume trillions of dollars. Just think how much had to be invested in all that. trillions of dollars. And here it turns out Maliuk, by making the decision to destroy Russia's strategic aviation, simply crossed out this almost century-long saga of essentially the plundering of the world's largest military budgets. Trillions of dollars were invested in this, and now they're simply unnecessary. A single Ukrainian security service showed a big fig to this entire strategic triad, no matter what it was. Moreover, even the nuclear component of this strategic triad doesn't scare us for one simple reason. We have nuclear strike capabilities that are much more powerful, stronger, and more problematic for the enemy than theirs. A nuclear warhead, when it explodes, sometimes it's not even clear whether it was a nuclear explosion or just a serious conventional missile. You can only tell with a radiometer. The radiance from radionuclides that accompanies a nuclear explosion, if it is an explosion, fades away quickly. And believe me, if you scatter spent nuclear fuel rods over Moscow, we've talked about this so many times, Lenin would come back to life. Yes, he'd be more alive than anyone from the radiation that would fall, say, on Red Square if the Russians used nuclear weapons against Ukraine. They understand this perfectly well. Why have they gone quiet about the nuclear topic now? Because they realized that it wasn't for nothing that a hole was made in the fourth reactor of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. Who knows what might fall out onto Grandpa Lenin? Maybe a third head will grow and start running around saying, "You're on the right path, comrades." Well, roughly in the direction they're pointing.
Roman Grigorievich, to wrap up, let me ask you the following question. First of all, after the SBU attacks on strategic nuclear aviation, Z channels reported the following information: that in Moscow, Lieutenant General Sergei Kobylash, the commander of the Russian Air Force, accidentally fell out of a window. And now everyone is starting to count how many strategic bombers we've destroyed or eliminated. That is, 41 have been damaged or destroyed. How significant are these losses? Please comment on this as a final point.
Well, if this isn't an information operation, and it could be a Russian information operation, since they sometimes inject this kind of event into the information flow through certain dubious channels. And then if the opposing side picks it up, for example, they present it as something negative, then they show this Kobylash, yes, and we'll go on to say what kind of people we supposedly are, not handling things properly. So for now, since there is no confirmation, and there really isn't any, we treat it accordingly. Although, strictly speaking, given the responsibility, well, Kobylash should have been made to fly. As for who will, so to speak, make him fly, or has made him, or will make him, that will depend on the Russian special services. Because if we're talking about real responsibility, it was specifically Kobylasz's responsibility to ensure the security of Russia's strategic nuclear triad. So, well, if not now, then he'll fly later. How else could it be?
Dear audience, please like this video. Roman Grigorievich and I meet 3 times a week to discuss the most pressing military topics and to celebrate the successes of our Ukrainian special services and the armed forces of Ukraine. We thank them, our deepest respect. The well-known analyst Roman Tsvetan. Roman Grigorievich, thank you very much as always. See you again soon this week.
Goodbye.